Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are. Warm greetings to you. This is a 1 hour exchange or discussion. It is an informal discussion on a question related to translation and conflict. The format would be as follows. I'm going to introduce very briefly, of course, the topic and the guest speaker in almost 5 minutes. And then I will hand it over to Professor Salama-Carr to make some introductory remarks for almost 10 to 15 minutes. And then we are going to open the discussion Q&A session with rounds, first round and then second round, and perhaps a third round of questions. So this is the structure of this talk and how it is divided. But excuse me, from now and then I have to accept newly arrived participants. So the question of translation and conflict, it is really complex because we have to investigate it at various layers. There are layers that are general, like the conflict or the conflicting approaches based on the source-oriented or source-focused let's say, mediation and target-focused or oriented mediation. The interpreter or the translator or the mediator, in this case, they have always been described or portrayed as agents or soldiers, even at the firing line. But there are other layers also, like a clash of ideologies or some other, let's say, cultural, let's say, sorts of clashes or differences. So, but the issue now is really relevant to ask the question about whether it is relevant or not to discuss the question of translation and conflict in the first place. Translation has always been described as a site of conflict and a site sometimes for conflict. And this also brings us to the role that can be played by the interpreter or the mediator or the translator, whether it is a role of a negotiator or a mere passive carrier of meaning, what has been said, not actively engaged in a, let's say, a multi-party interpreted event, and whether the interpreter is a peacemaker or just doing a job for someone. And here another question that can be raised, which is about loyalty. Who is paying for? Is he loyal to the one who is paying for his services, for example, or loyalty is to the ideology, to his own convictions, or he takes some position between both sides, the source and the target, the source language culture and the target language culture. So this is the question, perhaps, whether it is relevant to ask this question again or not, or it is an obsolete question and we should move on to ask other relevant questions. With us today, a scholar who is going to address and investigate these issues and questions. Myriam Salama-Carr is Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Manchester, Center for Translation and Intercultural Studies. She has published extensively in the field of translation studies, and her research focuses on the history of translation, with particular focus on the ideological aspects of the translation of science and the transmission of knowledge. She is the author of La traduction à l'époque abbasside, and the editor of Translating and Interpreting Conflict, 2007, and a special issue of Social Semiotics on Translation and Conflict, 2007 also. She has co-edited a special issue of Forum, 2009, on ideology and cross-cultural encounters. And by the way, the name of this series of encounters, talks, is also Encounters at the Shores of translation. And also Translator 2011 on translating science, and is also co-editor of the 2019 Palgrave Handbook of Languages and Conflict. She has participated as lead investigator in a QNRF-funded project on the construction of an anthology of the Arabic discourse on translation, 2015-2018, and is currently participating in the preparation of an English version of the anthology for Routledge to be published in 2020. She was the director of the National Network for Translation from 2007 to 2017, 10 years almost, and was chair of the training committee on IATIS from 2011-2016. This is our guest speaker. Without further ado, I hand it over to you, Myriam. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hammouda. Can you all hear me?
We do.
So thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you for inviting me to participate in those translation encounters. I'm really, delighted to meet you all virtually. I'm also very pleased. I know that I recognize some faces and some names. So, hello to you too, and thank you for being here. I think you mentioned the title of my brief talk today. Of course, this was very much a rhetorical question, and in no way was that sort of suggesting that that's it. We've said everything about translation and conflict. We can move on. We can move to something else. Unfortunately, this is not the case. So I'll take this rhetorical question as a starting point to sketch quite briefly how the discussion on translation and conflict has developed over the years in translation studies particularly, and to perhaps try to foreground some of the challenges that lie ahead in terms of research particularly. And I should say that I'm using here translation as a shortcut for both translation and interpreting, and I hope that my colleagues and interpreter colleagues and friends won't mind this too much. But I do mean translation and interpreting studies, particularly as interpreters are in the forefront when one talks about conflict, perhaps more than translators would be. Okay. So Dr. Salhi mentioned the edited book on language and conflict, and I will draw mainly on this this was really a collaborative project to talk of how the purpose of the book was really to take stock of the existing research and literature on translation and conflict, and also to try to identify further areas of research with a backdrop of interdisciplinarity. It was the project involved working with historians, working with the military, working with NGOs as well. The people who contributed were in, really different fields, and it was very enriching, certainly from my point of view. Okay, so I think anybody familiar with translation studies will probably agree that it is the subdiscipline, I think we can call it a subdiscipline of translation and conflict, has attracted huge interest in recent years. And there are particular real events which may have triggered this interest. Certainly, the September 2001 events and what follows, is the so-called war on terror. And a decade later, the Arab Spring. And of course, the conflict in the Balkans as well raised very interesting issues from the point of view of translation and, more particularly interpreting. So you had those kind of events which triggered interest, sometimes for very practical reasons. Certainly from the point of view of September 2001, and then the subsequent invasion of Iraq a couple of years later, it was very much the lack of interpreting, no capacity, or the fact that the interpreters didn't seem to be trained to deal with the situation, and also even to deal with Arabic. I mean, there was quite a shortage of interpreters and translators dealing with Arabic. So very practical reasons, in a sense, seems to have also triggered research, in academia. What has happened over the last, say 15 years is that the subdiscipline of translation and conflict has been somewhat codified, in the sense that you can find entries on translation and conflict nowadays in handbooks of translation, handbooks of interpreting. For instance, the Benjamin Handbook of Translation has got an entry on, I think it's entitled Conflict and Translation, or Translation and Conflict. I should know I wrote it, but it's this pair of, and the tension between the two. The Routledge Handbook of Translation and Culture, the Routledge Handbook of Translation and Politics. I mean, they do include specific chapters on translation and conflict, the Routledge Handbook of Interpreting Studies, and of course the Palgrave book that we have mentioned on languages and conflict. So the subdiscipline is accepted, it's there is literature on it, and you can find it on the encyclopedias. Special issues have also been published. For instance, the Translator had a special issue on, I think, in 2010, perhaps, on translation and violent conflict, and so on and so forth. So it's quite an established area. The theme has also been approached through the prism of various disciplines or subdisciplines. Critical discourse analysis seems to be perhaps the obvious framework to talk about the language and conflict and how it is translated, and certainly has been used to talk about translation, ideology and conflict. Of course, the narrative theory, so the work of Mona Baker applying narrative theory to translation, has been a very interesting and very conducive to research on the topic. So all those approaches came as well because there has been, and generally in translation studies, a shift from the text as if you want, a focus of study, from the text to the agent. And the agent is the translator, the interpreter. But when we talk about translation and conflict, we also have a whole range of intermediaries who are involved in this process of translation and interpreting, and they are not necessarily translators themselves. They are not necessarily interpreters. They could be the commissioners, or they could be, as was shown, in the context of the war, the invasion of Iraq, as the so-called fixers. And in the book I edited in 2007, Translating and Interpreting Conflict, a colleague working with media did write about the journalism and the fixers who happen to also translate and interpret. So the boundaries are getting a bit fuzzy there. What has also a change, as we may go back to this later, is the type of conflicts, the boundaries between civilian and military, and the conflicts which are, trade can be a conflict. Global trade can be conflictual. Climate change, environmental issues also lead to certain forms of conflicts in terms of access to resources, which have been taken into account increasingly, certainly as data for researchers. I have mentioned earlier on the need for interdisciplinarity, and the fact that when I was working on the Palgrave book project, it was very important to talk to historians. For instance, if you want to look at the role of translators and interpreters, it's quite useful to look at historical archives, or certainly to look at the analysis that historians are giving us of those archives, because the accounts you get of what the translators and interpreters did and how they position themselves can challenge the mainstream interpretations of what it is to be a translator and an interpreter. So that was, it's very, very interesting. And this interdisciplinary research has also helped to interrogate further the concept of neutrality. So a key term when we talk about the profession of the interpreter, or what the interpreter should be doing. But this concept of neutrality has been interrogated increasingly with reference to issues of ethics and professional codes of practice, and in some instances the two collide. So the professional code of practice and its insistence of neutrality might collide with issues of personal and professional ethics, which I think it's been quite, the development. Moira Ingilieri has worked quite extensively on this aspect. Another aspect that was interesting to look at was translation and the media, and translation and conflict in the media. Because although translation underpins much of the information that is disseminated and circulated in the media, it tends to remain invisible in, strictly speaking, journalistic accounts. So it's seen as transparent and non-controversial. The use of social media has also shown how narratives of conflicts can be not only circulated but constructed. I mean, we all have come across examples of the creation of such narratives. For instance, in the case of the Myanmar and and the way the Rohingya populations were treated, it has been said that Facebook played quite a role in propagating certain narratives. So social media can propagate hate, hate speech. I mean, we're all very much aware of it. So it's, and this is done through translation, but not necessarily articulated in that way. But we can be positive as well, because translation and conflict is also an area where we can see examples of really vibrant activism. So, translation and conflict is also kind of operating with the creation of solidarity movements, with activist movements. and quite a lot of interesting work has also been, has also been done in the field. These solidarity movements tend to contest mainstream narratives and what we are normally talking about, the mainstream media. And again, I mentioned Mona Baker here, is her edited volume on the Egyptian revolution, translating dissent. So it's in the context of the Egyptian revolution, and we know how the Arab Spring has given very, very interesting data from the point of view of the activism and the language of activism and how to translate that language. So an example of work, subtitlers, for instance, who challenge the official narratives, and sometimes at great risks to their, to themselves. There is also increasing visibility of the translator or the interpreter who are working with NGOs and humanitarian agencies, relief agencies. And these are not necessarily trained translators and interpreters, but they are, we certainly hear more about them, and there's more research going in that field. Those people who are said to work in fragile environments. I mean, that's the term that is used. What is also interesting here is that these not so much new modes of language mediation, but certainly newly recognized, more recently acknowledged and recognized ways of, doing translation and interpreting are given much more are getting much more visible within the training institution themselves. So there was a time when interpreting meant conference interpreting, a highly controlled, highly professional environment, and the rest was invisible. There has been a huge development of other modes of interpreting, and this can sometimes lead to tension. Julie Boyery, who has worked on activism and interpreting in activism, has discussed this kind of dichotomy of you have the engagement on one side and impartiality on the other, and how do you reconcile the two? Can you do that? But you also have this expertise versus grassroots activism, and sometimes it can clash. So this is sort of a brief overview of what is being done in the field of translation and interpreting and conflict. But if we look ahead, and this was one of the purposes of the aims of the Palgrave volume, was to look ahead and say what is next. I mean, what type of conflicts are we going to discuss from the point of view of translation and interpreting? And would be interesting to explore. And of course, there is aspects such as cyber warfare, the new modes of warfare, which throw up other issues. For instance, if you are using drones, what is happening in terms of the interface between the machinery and between the human, so between the equipment and the human, operators? Is there a translation element there? And there must be one. And this kind of new modes of war. The decreasing distinction as well between the military and the civilian in a number of conflicts, with the humanitarian consequences we have seen, is another development that is of interest to researchers in the fields. And I think it's a development that may have implications for the development of codes of conduct, because you're in a sense you are dealing with with different things. And finally, in terms of the issues ahead, I would like also to mention the issue of post-truth. I mean, you all have heard about post-truth, which is and fake news. Post-truth is the idea that what matters is really the emotional take, the subjective take on events, and not the facts. There is some disagreement at when post-truth started. You know, you may argue that there's always been post-truth. According to Matthew D'Ancona, who is a journalist who's written a short book about it, it started in 2016. So 2016, you know, events would include the American elections and the type of discourse that developed from it. And in the UK, the very divisive, very bitter Brexit debate and the kind of truth and counter-truths that were propagated. John Gray, you know, the British philosopher John Gray, argues that in fact post-truth and started with the invasion of Iraq and the dodgy dossier. Okay, so but to me this is of interest in the sense that yes, translators and interpreters have always dealt with material that they didn't necessarily believe. Even you can translate an interpreter even if you don't buy into what is being said. But it from a theoretical point of view, it really challenges ideas of trust. And if I can go back to a classic of translation studies, you know, George Steiner and the hermeneutic option, trust is one of the, you know, it's the first thing that the translator needs to start translating. You have to trust that there is something there. So how do you reconcile this with you know, with post-truth? I mean, it's a genuine question. I haven't elaborated on it, but I'd be delighted if it became a PhD project at some point, it's viable or not. There's also the question of loyalty that functional approaches to translation were stressing. You know, if you think of the work of Christian Nord. So where does loyalty lie when you are dealing with fake news or post-truth? And I would like to add something which may be less, I mean, more specific, and this has much to do with the language. But if you are a translator, or say particularly an interpreter, and you are used to complying with certain language conventions, for instance, the speech of a head of state would be normally rather formal, and you have to interpret heads of state who choose to talk in almost in Twitter style. And apparently this was a real issue for interpreters with a number of statements and speeches made by the President of the United States. Because, you know, you had comments from translators into Arabic, translators into Japanese, saying, how can I have to change it, I have to make it more formal. So because, and the conventions of what a head of state speech should sound like were completely disrupted, and it was quite. So these are the sort of types of challenges I think that are facing us, or facing, you know, perhaps areas of research, new forms of warfare, fuzzy boundaries. And the post-truth fake news aspect. I think I'll stop at this point, Hammouda, and very happy to hear your feedback.
Yes, please. The floor is yours, dear participants. Let's take a first round of questions by showing hands. Yes, there is Muhammad Salah, yes, I can see. Okay, go ahead, Muhammad Salah, and then Dhaha Mabruk, and then Abir Alwi. So, Muhammad Salah, go ahead.
Greetings, professors. So, my questions will focus on the cultural and ideological aspects. What are your thoughts when it comes to foreignization and domestication of translation? Should the translator send the reader or the listener abroad, and by that, metaphorically speaking, if he should allow the former to come into contact with the foreign culture of the source language, or should the translator do the reverse and move the author or the speaker closer to the reader or listener by adapting the text or the speech to the target language as much as possible? Thank you.
Thank you. So presumably you are talking, in general terms about when you translate, not specifically with reference translation conflict. I think this is a dichotomy which is very present in translation study, and in a sense, Venuti has politicized it. To his credit, I think it's very interesting to see how he has used this foreignization, domestication with reference to translating perhaps minority languages into more dominant languages. I don't think that you can give a blanket answer. It depends so much on the context. It depends on it depends on your ethics as well, and what you want to do with the text. It depends on the norms and the conventions. If I may take an example, this is not conflict, but it's to do, it's say in terms of literature, how literature is translated. Trying to problematize this distinction between foreignization and domestication. If you look at the way Arabic literature had traditionally been translated into French, there was a tendency to foreignize it, to make the foreignness of it very visible. It has been it is less the case with the translation of, for instance, the same novel into English. But what I would argue here is that foreignization, if we mean by foreignization keeping the foreign term or keeping the strangeness of the source text into the target text, foreignization can also be domesticating in a way, because it means complying with the conventions of the target language and the target culture. Don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I think with Venuti's dichotomy is it's very, very interesting. But I think it's generally in a political context. It's the idea that the translator is really, whether you work for minority language into dominant language, or vice versa. But I don't think you can say that one approach is better than the other, or easier.
Thank you, dear Professor.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Abir.
Professor Myriam, we are dealing with the translating conflicts. Maybe when you are dealing with such translation in maybe interpreting in such conference, and you deal with some conflicts, how do you deal with that? Example, we have the conflicts in Libya. How should the interpreter or the translator deal with that? I don't know.
I wish I had the answer. Well, as a general rule, the interpreter would be interpreting for a particular conference. There will be a particular commissioner. It is hoped that the interpreter will also be given some kind of a glossary. What is the term? What is the accepted term, for instance? I think it's very unfair to expect the interpreter to decide. If you take the example of names, for instance, names of places, there's ideology is really underpinning what terms we use. If you are referring to Al-Quds and you translate it as Jerusalem or vice versa, are you actually taking a stand, or are you just saying, well, according to the convention, in the context of the UN, it would be such and such thing? You sometimes have the possibility of putting the two together, and some certainly translators do it. I appreciate that it's a bit more difficult with interpreting, but you cannot. we talk about engagement and activism, but as an interpreter, you have to. I mean, it's what the speaker said, and whether or not if you disagree with what the speaker said, you cannot change what she said just because you disagree with it. If you want, the ethical stand would be to refuse to carry out certain assignments. I think that's.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. There is another question, Professor Salama-Carr, by Richard Watts. He said, quote, "I was intrigued by your mention of conflict around the climate crisis. What avenues do you see for research in translation studies that addresses these emerging conflicts?" And I would like to add one more question to this. And you also mentioned cyber warfare, and especially the idea of mediation. Perhaps this is not a human-mediated exchange in this warfare, but rather a machine-mediated exchange. So what avenues also can you see in translation studies by including the machine as another agent for war or for peace in the mediation or the negotiation of meaning between a drone, for example, or an operator? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm thinking of science fiction here. When the machine has mediator. But you are right. I mean, so I'm taking the last part of the question on the cyber warfare. I assume that at some point there has been human intervention to decide on what terms to use, and that there'll be a sort of agreed language for cyber warfare. So in that sense, that's where the language aspect comes into it. But you can perfectly use take the equipment, take the machine into account. Perhaps not as an intermediary, but if you are interested in sociological approaches such as that of Bruno Latour, and then the action network approach. Things become aspects that you need to take into account in your discussion. So I think it would perfectly fit there. Okay, so that's for the mediation aspect. I think the first question was to do with climate change.
Yeah, climate crisis and the conflict around the climate crisis. Yes.
Well, I think that perhaps two things here on the ground. There is increasingly active movements against climate change or against what we are doing to the environment. I mean, Extinction Rebellion is one example. Very, very committed people who are, there are transnational movements, translation operate there. And there is a conflict between what they want the world to do about the environment and for instance, what states and corporations refuse to do. But also, more specifically, climate disasters do lead to conflicts. You have situations, and I think this is probably the case with the Darfur situation, in Sudan, where problems are created because of access or limited access to resources. And the translators and interpreters who have to deal with those emergencies find themselves in very conflictual situations. So these are, in a sense, new types of conflicts. From the point of view of conflict and the environment, there's a very interesting book by Michael Cronin on the age of the Anthropocene, where he deals with, it's more how we as humans should communicate and should learn from other species. So it's engaging with the rest of the creation, the rest of nature, etc. And one example of this, and an area that I'm getting increasingly interested in, is that of animal rights. And there as well, you have conflict. You have philosophical tension. You have the use of language in the field is incredibly controversial. So these are the things I had in mind.
Excellent. So we have two requests, Duha Mabruk and then Nisreen Talous. Duha, please.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. And again, thank you, Dr. Hammouda, for allowing this opportunity to be. My question is twofold. So you talked a lot about conflicts and ethical backgrounds and having accepted or refused jobs based on that. And I actually believe that everything is political and we cannot not choose a side, because not choosing is choosing in itself. So when and how can we afford to refuse or accept jobs? Do you actually, do you do a background check on the corporations that you work with? Do you try to see if you are congruent with the conglomerates that you work with, the organizations, whether NGOs or not? And how can the interpreter manage to be at the same time interpreting, doing his job, and be a peacekeeper, a literal one?
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Well, ideally, in an ideal world, you would be checking and you would be refusing to deal with materials that you find objectionable. And I think translators and interpreters probably do this every day. There is a price to pay. And if I may give you an example based on my own experience, quite a long time ago, when I was working as a staff translator, I was a vegetarian at the time, and I was asked to translate a text about slaughterhouse implements. It wasn't a very long text, and I told my manager, I'm a vegetarian. I really, I'm not dealing with this text. I can't do it. And they were, quite understanding and gave the job to someone else and put me on a different type of text. But I was very aware at the time that I was lucky in the sense that they were understanding. It was a short text, but I'm pretty sure that if they had had a contract with the meat industry and one of their translators said, no, I'm not touching it, I would have had to choose between my job, and my conscience. And I'm sure, and I was lucky in the sense that I didn't have to then. But it's presumably this happen in other areas as well. You can refuse, in theory, you can refuse to do something that you find objectionable. It's not always easy, and some people find themselves in circumstances where they deal with pretty unsavory material. But there is a principle, and there is what each of us can do and how far we can go. Thank
you. So Nisreen Talous.
Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for being our guest. So I want to go back to the part where you mentioned that interpreters face problems while interpreting the US president's speech and his way of delivering it. Don't you think that the interpreter should reserve the attitude and the specific words he uses rather than the formal aspect, so that the audience of the target language get the full image, even in critical times?
I don't think that the interpreters found it that easy. I think it was an interpreter into Arabic who said, if we interpret what the president is saying in the same style in Arabic, he will sound like a 5-year-old. The president will sound like a 5-year-old, and the interpreter felt he just could not do it. I think we also have to take into account that perhaps some languages are more flexible or more accepting of informality than others. And certainly the Japanese translators were very, very ill at ease with, rendering the same style. So I'm not, I mean, if I were in that position, I think I probably would try to observe the conventions in the target language, rather than just translating in such a way so I interpret it so everybody's, what a way of expressing himself. That's generally what the interpreters did anyway.
True. We have another question from Samar, quote, "My question is, how would intersemiotic translation be incorporated in discussions of translation and conflict? For instance, as pictures are forming and reforming narratives in Instagram. So how would we incorporate that in translation studies? The intersemiotic translation."
Well, I think that it is incorporated to some extent. I mean, narrative theory, for instance, would look at not only the text, but the way the text is framed. And if you think of literary translations, for instance, the very cover of a book, of a translated book, is already a way of making of positioning the book. So to some extent, it is taken into account. What is very interesting, of course, is all the the images that social media carries, and all the signs. I mean, are they universals or? But I think that the intersemiotic has already been taken into account in translation, and it's going to become more and more so, because it seems that the visual takes over more and more, on the textual, and the gestures as well. And in translation, interpreting conflict, presumably there could be quite a lot of that needs to be taken into account. The body language.
Yeah.
As well.
Thank you. Nadir, and then Ines Hajri. Nadir, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, are you hearing me?
Yes, well, I can hear you.
Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You are welcome, dear honorable guest, dear professor, and dear student, dear colleagues. At least I will have only one question in relation to the controversial relationship between translation and conflicts and wars. Do you think that the job of translator or translation in general and then interpreting nourishes the war or the opposite? And thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I would never say that the translator and the interpreter should sort of promote war and promote conflict. But in practice, translation can do this. So it's this image. The image of the bridges was used quite often. Translation is about building bridges. Yes, it is, and I think ultimately it is. But it is also used to create conflict.
Carr, sorry, just to step in. Can you think of a situation in which translation and translators can fuel war and conflict rather than serving peace?
Well, you could think of the use of a term, for instance, a neutral term which is replaced with a much more marked term, and create antagonism in the you know, the other party. And I haven't, you know, an example in mind, but in histories of interpreting, you find quite a few of those instances. Sometimes it's the wrong term, means, you know, it's that the other party is aggrieved. So it can happen in terms of how translation is used. And I think that's, you know, going back again to Mona Baker's book on translation conflict, she showed how memory, for instance, you know, the American website, which gives information between inverted commas on the Arab world, was systematically framing the text to project a very negative idea of the Arab world, a very negative image of the Arab world abroad, or, you know, in the United States. Sorry. So yes, you can use translation in that way. Whether the translator, the interpreter is fully part of it is again, it's a question of personal ethics. Whether you want to do it well. But can I read a very, very short extract of a
Please.
poem?
Yes, go ahead.
So that we, you know, because I think one of the questions talked about the positive aspect of translation. It's something that I have cited before. The Sarah Maguire, some of you may have heard of her, she passed away a couple of years ago, I think, was an Irish translator who was translating Arabic into English, and she was also a poet. And she wrote, you know, talking about translation as a positive aspect. She wrote a poem, and if I can read a few lines of this. I ask for a liquid dissolution. Let borders dissolve. Let words dissolve. Let English absorb the fluency of Arabic with ease. Let us speak in wet tones. Look, the Liffey is full of itself, so I post it to Ramallah to meet up with the Jordan. Thank you. Okay. So the positive aspect of translation.
Yes. We have Ines, Ines Hajri, yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you, Dr. Hammouda, for the opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Myriam, for the interesting lecture. So we live and function in a climate of conflict, as Mona Baker says, and the interpreter is visible in the new literature. So my question is, to what extent do you think the interpreter, he or she, or the translator, is an active participant in the post-truth era? Thank you.
Well, I think he's a very, very active participant. I just think that the challenges are even greater in dealing with material that is so fuzzy, so untrue, or that challenges what you know. So yes, I think the post-truth is in a sense it's a challenge for the interpreter, for the translator, but the translator has still got to be a very active participant, and is, I think, by definition.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I think there is no other question. I have a question related to not the conflict itself or the era of the conflict, but rather the post-conflict, post-war, post-revolution era. Do you also incorporate, theoretically speaking at least, the discipline, let's say, of translation in conflict? You incorporate also the translation or the interpreting of the tensions underpinning the justice restoration, especially in transitional justice. I have been involved in so many programs in transitional justice here in Tunisia and elsewhere. And I can see the tension is very high, always. Sometimes it is higher than in the era of conflict itself. I've been involved, and you mentioned Darfur, in Sudan as a whole now, in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Tunisia after revolution, and Yemen even. Writing a constitution is really conflictual. The collective memory, how to preserve the collective memory, the identity of people now in Tunisia and in Algeria and Libya. There is a struggle, a conflict of identities. The Berber or the Arab identity, all of a sudden they have become very vocal in a way. In addition to the reform programs, reforming the police, the military, and you mentioned the military, and the vetting, like the Baathification in Iraq, for example. So do you think that also translating tensions like that are also translating conflict? Do you involve them in the conflict side? Thank you.
Absolutely. I think maybe there is a tendency when we talk of translation and conflict to think of a conflict as something that is well defined, with boundaries, with a beginning and an end. But there is what is before. So if you are looking at, for instance, military intelligence, prior to a conflict possibly, and then the sequels, the aftermath of a conflict, and so much of the work, for instance, that NGOs carry out, humanitarian work in post-conflict situations, and so it has to be seen as a continuum. You mentioned there's the aspect of reconciliation as well. Translation was key, for instance, in South Africa, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a very, very important aspect of, I think, translation and conflict will carry on, of course, and and new conflicts stem from it. But yes, absolutely, and I think this is where more work is needed. With boundaries are not well defined yet.
They are fuzzy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other question from the floor, from the participants? I can't see any hand shown. If there are no questions, I cannot get the whole speakers.
Hello, sir.
Yes, please go ahead.
Muhammad Mansouri needs to take the word.
Yes, Professor Mansouri, go ahead, please. Sorry, I didn't see him.
Your mic, Dr. Mansouri.
Dr. Mansouri, can you unmute the mic?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly well.
Can you get me now?
We get you. Let's go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to speak a little bit about those issues of destabilizing or the disruption that was mentioned in the presentation, a presentation that I really appreciate. This disruption sometimes arises from a shift of register or shift of genre. There's someone speaking and the interpreter is following, but then there's a reference to something that is very local, let's say in the US, or a shift into Twitter language or something like this. The interpreter has that additional strain of trying to adapt and also to construe the background, the cultural background behind this. It could be a serial that is watched in the US, and then you have to display knowledge of this. So this is one of the issues I believe. The other issue that relates to trust, confidence, and neutrality is that which comes from asides. I served in the refugee camps, and immediately after an interview, there's someone that gives you additional information. These people didn't want to share that information during the interview. So when you come to the next interview, you are an insider into the knowledge of the person being interviewed. How can you make sure those asides or that information that you got from the refugee on a one-to-one or in a one-to-one situation, how can you keep it at bay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mansouri.
How can you keep it? Well, I would have thought that the codes the codes of conduct for the interpreters, as far as I'm aware, for instance, in public service interpreting, prevent the interpreter from using information that they have at their disposal, that they have acquired outside the setting, whether to help the people they are interpreting for on either side, whether to help them or to make things even more difficult for them. And this is why, presumably, there's quite a few contexts where it is, there is great care taken for the interpreter, for instance, not to spend time alone with the defendant, in court interpreting before the interpreting session starts. But I would think that it's a question of, ethics and professional conduct, that you wouldn't really want to use this information either for or against. But I think it's very difficult it is a question of ethics, and it's very difficult to codify it, and that this is what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Because, those environments that you refer to are particularly, fragile, are particularly, shifting. I don't know whether, I don't really have a fuller answer to give.
No, it is true. It is very difficult. And the interpreter will have that knowledge anyway. So it will be there. And it is very, very difficult to keep at bay. Now, if I were to, return to the first question, I was once attending a conference where somebody was offering training on security. And at a certain point, to clinch his argument, he said, better be tried by 12 than be carried by 6. He was talking about whether to shoot or not in situations where the security, or I say the safety of a law enforcement personnel is being under threat. So in order to clinch his argument, he said, better be tried by 12 than be carried by 6. Now the interpreter will have to construe where that comes from. Is go inside the culture from which this statement comes, which actually meant that I'd shoot and then be tried by a jury of 12, then die. The interpreter at that time said, let his mother cry, not mine.
Yeah.
Knowing that he was translating for an audience that didn't have any background knowledge about being tried by 12 and being carried by 6. So I felt that that was a good find, because, you're talking to the people, to the recipients of the message in language that they know, not just language that they know, but in concepts that they are familiar with. So that was my point, that is disrupting, your reference by shifting from one thing to another, from security to an aspect that is, if you like, very deeply rooted in the source culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that was just the point that I wanted to say.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for this exchange. We have another question, request. Shayma Gizani. Go ahead, please.
Hello everyone. I'm wondering if there is any judicial consequences for for the translator who is not loyal, neutral, or honest. What is there any law, any restrictions? What are the consequences?
Perhaps a question
Well,
about accountability, to hold an interpreter or translator accountable for not being loyal or faithful.
I am not. I mean, I suppose it will depend very much on the context, on the country, you know, where the exchange is taking place. I suppose the interpreter, if it could come under the issue of the interpreter not being competent. You know, I mean, the user of the interpreting services might claim that the interpreter failed to be, wasn't neutral enough and was therefore not competent enough. But I can't see. I'm not sure this can be enshrined in any legislation, but I don't know. I mean, would it be considered as a mistake? And then there's the issue of how do you define neutral anyway? When you say the interpreter wasn't neutral, it might be debatable. I mean, the interpreter may be taken to task for not using the right term.
I'm talking about a miscarriage of the meaning in purpose.
But you'd have to show that it was done on purpose, I suppose. I'm not aware of cases where interpreters were sort of taken to task and sued for having distorted the meaning on purpose, but there may be such instances. I don't know. Okay.
Thank you. Any other question? I can't see any other hand. So I think we are coming to the end of this very informative and rich informal discussion about translation and conflict. We have discussed so many issues related to translation, how to define translation, translator, the role of interpreters, mediators, and the conflict, the layers of conflict, the phases during the conflict and the post-conflict era. So with that, we would like to thank you very much, Professor Carr, for accepting our invitation in this encounter, which is, as you know, part of a whole series of other encounters called Encounters at the Shores of Translation. We have had this chat at those shores, and we hope to meet you again, and we have another meeting in almost let's say 2 hours or 1 hour 45 minutes with Professor Daoud. By the way, Professor Mansouri is also another guest speaker who will be speaking, I think, in 2 days. So thank you very much. Thank you all. I would like to thank our guests. Here Richard Watts, Aida Sadiq, Marie and Nadim Carr, Philip Towner, Rim Hassan, Mohammed Mansouri, and Marco Barletta. And I would like to thank also my students at the Master's Program in Translation and Interpreting at the University of Tunis, Manar. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for your questions, and all the best with carrying on with translation, researching, translation, interpreting. And I'm not going to wish more conflicts for us so that you get nice data. There's plenty of it anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.